So it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Jacqueline Deal, tonight. Jackie is a graduate of Oxford University and has an undergraduate degree from Harvard. So unless you go to the Indian Institute for Technology, these are not safety schools for people. She's very, very intelligent. She is a senior fellow at FPRI in both the National Security and Asia programs, and more importantly, she is the president and CEO of the Long-Term Strategy Group, which is a defense consultancy in Washington, D.C., formerly of Cambridge, Massachusetts. At Long-Term Strategy Group, she's done a lot of extensive work for the Office of Secretary of Defense, Net Assessment Office, on projects related to East Asia. Recent studies include an analysis of security implications of alternative Chinese futures, an assessment of China's capacity for technological innovation, and a book chapter on China's energy security strategy. Jackie has held fellowships at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and also the former John M. Olin Institute for Strategic Studies. And she has published widely in publications such as the New York Times, Policy Review, Weekly Standard, War and History, Orbis, and has been consulted by a number of various news sources that most people in this room have read. Prior to coming into the national security space, she worked as a journalist and as an investment analyst. So without further ado, Jackie. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I know that the previous talk in this series was about the Middle East, and the next talk is about the U.S. Civil War. So I was hoping that I could give you something kind of uplifting, a break, but I'm afraid I don't think I can. So the topic of my talk this evening is long-term competition with China. And I wanted to begin by asking how the next U.S. presidential administration is going to act vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China, the PRC. My argument tonight is that change is coming, and not because we want it to, but because of how the PRC is using its new wealth and power. The U.S.-PRC relationship is increasingly going to be competitive. In fact, from the Chinese point of view, we've already been competing for decades, but the U.S. is only just on the verge of recognizing this. So this talk is about how we see the world and how the PRC's rulers see the world and where those two visions are leading us. Just to give you a roadmap, it's a three-part talk. I'll first briefly discuss our view. That should be pretty familiar to the Americans in the room. And then I'll talk about the PRC's view, how the world looks from Beijing, their understanding of recent history. And that'll set us up nicely to discuss the third subject, the outlines of the emerging competition and the choices that the next US president may confront. So first, our view. For several decades now, our strategy has been consistent. The American strategy vis-a-vis China has been about economic engagement with hedging on the military side. We like to say that there are cooperative and competitive elements of the relationship, but basically the balance or focus of our efforts has been on the cooperation. This cooperation has mostly been in the economic sphere with trade and financial deals, but also, at least on our side, there's been a desire to see Beijing increasingly as a partner in dealing with North Korea, with the threat of terrorism from radical Islamist groups, with environmental challenges. We think of all of this as win-win. The Chinese get rich, and they help us deal with global problems. And we've tended to see the points where we conflict or where our interests are competitive as basically being inconvenient. Those points have included Taiwan historically, but also increasingly territorial disputes between China and Japan in the East China Sea, and between China and the Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries in the South China Sea. Of course, our military has had to focus on those challenges, as well as on the general challenge posed by the PRC's rapid military buildup over the past 2 decades. We've seen China field an aircraft carrier and advanced fighter jets, send naval flotillas around the world, and perhaps most troubling, deploy precise conventional missiles capable of hitting Taiwan, but also US bases and even mobile forces, our mobile forces in the Western Pacific. But the US-China relationship hasn't mostly revolved around those aspects of military competition. You may have heard about what I just mentioned, but I'm pretty sure you've heard more about economics, the size of the Chinese market, technology transfer, business, financial deals, diplomacy, social relationships, expanding people-to-people ties, the arts, movies, culture. The goal of our strategy was to welcome China into the family of advanced, developed, liberal, international law-abiding nations, and the theory was that as the PRC got richer, it would naturally mellow. The communist, single-party, autocratic elements of its political system would be eroded even further than they already were after the demise of Chairman Mao and the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War, which for us at least showed that communism was a dead end. But now, perhaps ever since 2008, the year when our economy crashed and China hosted the Summer Olympics successfully, we see that the PRC isn't becoming another great power in our image. It's not transforming into a liberal, international law-abiding state as it gets richer. It's now the second biggest economy in the world, and yet the Chinese Communist Party remains the sole holder of power, and it's spending more than ever on internal security, surveillance, repression. The space for freedom of expression, free assembly, religious belief, and human rights advocacy has contracted over the past decade in China. Many people in the PRC now say that this is the worst period they've ever seen with regard to access to information, the detention of dissidents, and a general climate of fear. Some of you probably saw that over the last few months, even book publishers in Hong Kong were kidnapped for interrogation on the mainland. So the reach of the Chinese police state actually seems to be growing. So what's going on? Why did the United States make the wrong bet? Why isn't China becoming more like us and more like the responsible stakeholder that we would like it to be, to use a phrase from the Bush administration? So let me turn now to the second part of my remarks about the Chinese point of view. From their point of view, from the perspective of Xi Jinping as the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, there are actually very good reasons for staying the course, that is, for not giving up power. Xi and his fellow elites think that they're winning. They're beating us in a long-term competition that they diagnosed a long time ago. It turns out that our view of making China richer and welcoming it into the liberal international order was not only completely different from the Chinese Communist Party leadership's outlook, it was positively threatening. To understand where we are today and where we're headed, we have to understand US-China relations from Beijing's point of view. First, with regard to the idea of the PRC becoming less communist, of course that has happened, but only in the sense of Marxist economics, not in the sense of ceding power or developing a more pluralistic, internally competitive political system. One only has to observe the ongoing anti-corruption campaign in the PRC to understand the stakes associated with losing power there. Since 2013, 200,000 party members and officials have been investigated with a 99% conviction rate. That means once the Communist Party's Central Discipline Inspection Commission turns its eyes on you, you're toast. You go to jail, you disappear, your assets are seized, your family lives in penury and fear. And Xi has shown no hesitation to go after very senior people in the party, from Bo Xilai, the famous princeling who may have been a rival to succeed Hu Jintao, to Zhou Yonghong, the former oil baron and internal security czar, to Xu Caiho, a Chinese general and former vice chairman of the Central Military Commission. The CMC is the 11-member body composed of officers and Xi himself that runs China's military, and Guo Boxiong, another general and former CMC vice chair. So with regard to the broader liberal order into which we were hoping to integrate the PRC, most Americans believe that international law and respect for the sovereignty of individual nation states works. Disputes can be resolved by means of institutions, markets efficiently allocate supply in accordance with demand, and there are no real problems of scarcity in the world, or there shouldn't be. We basically have a benign view of international relations, with the exception of some hotspots in the Middle East, and now Russia, problematic actors in a couple other places, North Korea. But from the Chinese perspective, and this is based on my reading of many Chinese primary sources written by authoritative intellectuals, competition and conflict are endemic. The world is home to a global competition for resources and for control of key geographic points or locations. The competition is zero-sum and cutthroat. It's very much a dog-eat-dog world out there, and Chinese culture even tends to describe this competition in racial terms. So it's pretty much the opposite of the win-win, rising tide lifts all boats, American or Western view of international commerce and diplomacy. Chinese writers throw around the word hegemon. They mean it. They talk about US and Russian superpower efforts to dominate the global commons, from the oceans to outer space and cyberspace, that they see as vital to 21st century power. Chinese elites are convinced that the PRC started out in a dangerous, unenviable position because it came very late to this competition. They're only just now catching up, and the United States in particular might decide to try to erase their gains, so this is a critical time. Let me just take you through the history briefly so you'll understand where China's leaders think they are today and how different it is from where we think or hoped that they'd be. You know the history of how China under the declining Qing dynasty was targeted by foreign powers, including the Russians, the Germans, the Brits, the French, the Americans, and the Japanese. In the late 19th and early 20th century, they took treaty ports and used their military power to manipulate trade terms to their advantage. Remember that as late as the 1940s, Japan occupied large portions of central China. And even after the Allies, including China, won the Second World War, it took a civil war for the communists to unify the mainland. And then, thanks to Mao's disastrous economic policies, 40 million people died in a famine after the Great Leap Forward at the end of the 1950s, and Mao eviscerated China's educated ranks in the Cultural Revolution from the mid-60s to the mid-1970s. So the PRC was very weak until very late, very recently. And it was still struggling with major external threats. Cast your minds back to the late Cold War period. Following the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s, Chinese leaders were obsessed with the perceived threat from Moscow. Both the Russians and the Chinese massed troops along their disputed border throughout the decade, and they even fought a border war in 1969. In the 1970s, the PRC was so worried about Soviet aggression that it made sense to engage in a rapprochement with the United States, i.e. the people who had supported the nationalists, the wrong side in the Chinese Civil War, and still recognized Taiwan as China. At the time Deng Xiaoping took over after Mao's death, he was worried that the Russians had signed a defense treaty with the Vietnamese in 1978, so the PRC was going to be surrounded. He invaded Vietnam. China invaded Vietnam in 1979. He thought he needed to fight the Vietnamese to ensure that the United States would see the PRC as a friend and back it against the Russians. And Vietnam gave him a pretext by mistreating ethnic Chinese in Vietnam and invading Cambodia. What Deng was mostly after by this time was American economic and technological support, because he realized that the Soviet model was troubled, it clearly wasn't delivering economically, and it hadn't made the PRC strong. Domestic instability loomed unless he could turn things around. So he launched a revolutionary policy in the 1980s of reform and opening to the West. Deng was no liberal. He viewed this policy instrumentally as a means to ensure the Chinese Communist Party's survival. The idea was that by allowing in foreign, i.e. American, money and know-how, China would grow economically and eventually be able to modernize militarily. This would ensure that the PRC would finally be in the driving seat vis-a-vis outside rivals who had preyed on it when it was weak. It could coerce, deter, if necessary, defeat any potential opponent once it was strong. Wealth and military power were the keys to staying in power and succeeding in a dangerous world for the Chinese Communist Party leadership. So Deng adopted in 1986 the State High Technology Research and Development Plan, better known as the 863 program, which entailed spending billions of dollars to improve the PRC's technological position, gaining access to cutting-edge information technology, automation or computing power, space capabilities, lasers, energy technologies, and new materials. This initiative has been called the PRC's Sputnik moment, and it worked in that it yielded the space weapons and high-powered lasers that the PLA, the Chinese military, has fielded over the past decade. There was a hiccup for Deng in 1989, though, when his regime cracked down on pro-democracy protesters in Tiananmen Square, and the world recoiled at the image of Chinese troops firing on civilians. This was a setback for the PRC's access to technology and investment as the West imposed sanctions, cutting off defense exports and severely limiting transfers of dual-use items related to satellites, nuclear weapons, computers. But Deng saw a way through. He bolstered regime legitimacy domestically by investing in a patriotic education campaign designed to glorify the Chinese Communist Party and demonize outside powers, particularly Japan and the West. And meanwhile, externally, the West ultimately did not cut off ties or investment with China. So Deng reiterated the importance of strategic patience to buy time for the PRC to grow economically and militarily by exploiting outside resources and know-how. In the words of the 24-character strategy that he promulgated at this time, the PRC should, quote, hide its capabilities and bide its time. This impulse was reinforced by the relatively easy American victory over Iraq in 1990 and 91, and by the US campaigns in Bosnia and Kosovo, culminating in the accidental US bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, experiences that demonstrated the potency of the American military's penetrating, highly accurate weapons. Even after the accidental bombing, China's leaders, now under Deng's successor Jiang Zemin, elected to stay the course with hiding and biding. Things were going well. Jiang had encouraged Chinese firms to go out internationally throughout the decade of the 90s, acquiring overseas technology, investments, and interests. The PRC became a net energy importer back in 1993, and its appetite for energy from the Middle East, Central Asia, and Africa steadily grew as it industrialized to become the world's manufacturer, ushering in a remarkable period of export-led growth. By 2000, China's GDP was already the 5th largest in the world, and then in 2001, the United States was hit with the 9/11 attacks, after which Chinese strategists recognized that we, the United States, would be preoccupied with challenges in the Middle East and Central Asia for the foreseeable future. So by 2002, you see Chinese analysts referring to the first 2 decades of the 21st century as a, quote, period of strategic opportunity for Beijing. In other words, the hegemon, the United States, was not going to preempt the PRC's rise because it would be too busy fighting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. In the meantime, the 2000s saw the PRC's technology acquisition and defense investment begin to pay dividends. By the mid-2000s, it was ready to test lasers capable of blinding US satellites, upon which our economy and our military rely. The aircraft carrier program was coming to fruition, and the PRC was fielding large numbers of short and medium-range conventional missiles and building the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems to enable them to be very precise. So Jiang's successor, Hu Jintao, presided over the beginnings of a debate about whether it still made sense for the PRC to hide and bide. By January 2007, the PRC's anti-satellite test had certainly gotten the world's attention, and you can make the case that it was increasingly hard to conceal Beijing's other advanced weapons, which after all had to be tested and exercised. The PRC's economy was on track to overtake Japan's, so at what point was modesty unrealistic or counterproductive for the PRC? Meanwhile, throughout the 2000s, the PRC was continuing to acquire overseas interests as per Jiang's going out policy. By 2011, the PRC was the world's biggest energy consumer. So starting in 2004, the Chinese military, the PLA, was actually tasked by Hu Jintao with protecting the PRC's interests globally. This was the beginning of a major shift away from the territorial and border defense and internal security missions that had been predominant for the PLA through the Cold War and post-Cold War period up to that point. Hu Jintao was a relatively cautious leader, and he was not inclined to shift away publicly from hiding and biding. But the 2008 global financial crisis, coupled with Beijing's hosting of the Olympics that summer, was another huge moment that seemed to invite the PRC to become more outwardly bold or assertive. And in 2010, Hu Jintao himself reportedly endorsed a slight modification or reframing of the 24-character strategy from not just keeping a low profile to proactively getting things done. And from that moment, we can observe PRC behavior in international forums and disputes that can only be characterized as more in our face and in the face of our friends and our allies. From waving a finger at President Obama at climate change talks in Copenhagen in 2009 to yelling at Hillary Clinton at an ASEAN forum in 2010, protecting the DPRK after the sinking of the South Korean ship, the Chonan, and missile firings at a South Korean island in that same year, announcing an ADIZ over the East China Sea in 2013, confronting the Japanese over the Senkakus and increasingly challenging their administrative control since 2008, escalating the dispute with Vietnam and the Philippines in the South China Sea and referring to it as a core interest in 2010, the Scarborough Shoal confrontation with the Philippines and the United States in 2012, sending oil rig 981 to the Paracels in the South China Sea right off of Vietnam in the summer of 2014, reclaiming most recently 2,000 acres of land on which to build runways and dredge ports in the South China Sea while promising publicly not to proceed or to militarize the area. So there's a long list of actions that seem to be flirting with, no longer hiding and biding, but more actively asserting the PRC's interests at the expense of others. Xi Jinping, who came to power in 2012, seems to be a different sort of leader from Hu Jintao, but it's not just about his charisma or his consolidation of power, because the trends were in place before he acceded. The basic fact is that the PRC has recently acquired global interest and global economic and political influence, and it's in the process of building a military to defend those interests. Historically, the Chinese feel that they have been beset by by outside developed powers from Japan and Russia to the West. And today, Chinese strategists still feel surrounded by these powers and by their allies. The mindset I described has not changed even as the PRC's wealth and international standing have increased. Chinese military writings look with concern over the improvement in the US-Japan alliance, in the continuing US military relationship with Taiwan, and they refer to this new phenomenon of, quote, dual arcs and dual anchors, which troubles them. The dual arcs are the Japanese and the Indians coming together to extend more influence in the South China Sea, and the dual anchors are the Japanese and the Australians coming together, working more together to block China's access to the Western Pacific. This is how they perceive the map and the world. So in their words, and now I'm going to paraphrase an authoritative Chinese military textbook, the problem is that more than 60% of China's GDP comes from trade, and 90% of China's imports and exports travel by sea. International waterways and straits are thus China's lifelines, yet they are not owned by China, nor are they controlled by China. This is a problem. It means that China's sea transport could be cut off, depriving the mainland of critical resources, such as uranium and iron ore, for which China's foreign dependence exceeds 50%. So you can find similar expressions of concern about US space capabilities, information technologies, and assertions of how the PRC will neutralize our advantages or supersede them in these books, in these textbooks, and other military writings. Let me shift now to my third subject, the contours of the emerging competition. As the PRC sees it, its dependence on vulnerable overseas assets is the bad news. But the good news is that the United States remains distracted by terrorism and other challenges and constrained by the after effects of the 2008 economic crisis. Chinese sources note that we are at an unusual moment historically where economic interdependence and the PRC's image as a constructive partner for the United States on terrorism and climate change make it harder for Washington to distinguish between friend and foe. Tensions between the United States and China may spike at times, they write, but the Chinese are confident that they will then ebb and remain within a certain manageable band. All of this gives the PRC the opportunity to act more assertively, to try to lock in dominance over key geographic regions, resource routes, and resources themselves. Hence Xi Jinping's One Belt, One Road initiative and his escalation in the South China Sea, which is the transit corridor not just for China, but for Middle Eastern and African oil to other East Asian powers, and which is home to fisheries, a major source of protein, and local oil and gas deposits. So all of that makes the South China Sea attractive, but the big prize is to get the United States out of the PRC's backyard, to help the PRC overcome what Chinese military officers often refer to as the C-shaped encirclement that it faces, thanks to the chain of democratic, peninsular, and island countries running from South Korea and Japan to Taiwan and the Philippine archipelago down to Indonesia and Australia. However, as you all know, the PRC's economic growth has begun to slow, and in the face of a contracting economy, the pressure on Xi to secure overseas interests and resources may grow to the point where he engages in behavior that even a distracted United States can't or shouldn't ignore. Last summer's Chinese stock market perturbations, the continuing anti-corruption campaign that I mentioned, capital outflows, currency depreciation, and a reinvigorated patriotic education campaign that was just announced that is supposed to even target overseas Chinese, they're all warning signs that pressure is building up in the Chinese system. And when I say that we can't or shouldn't ignore the coming challenges, I mean that it's not just our interests, for instance, in freedom of navigation, that are at stake. It's the interests of our allies like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and the Philippines. But the PRC sees that if we don't come to the defense of those allies, then we will lose the basis of our position in the Asia-Pacific. So it seems likely that as domestic pressure rises, Xi Jinping will continue to go after US allies in particular, but especially Japan, because of our bases there, and because of the extraordinarily high levels of anti-Japanese sentiment in the PRC, thanks to the PRC's ongoing patriotic education campaign. So the military aspects and the diplomatic aspects of the competition involve those precise missiles and the space weapons that I mentioned, being able to, the fact that the Chinese military will increasingly be able to threaten key US staging points for our ability to project power into the Western Pacific. But it's also important to recognize the economic dimensions of the competition. And usually people from Washington, as opposed to New York, or people from the Defense Department, as opposed to the Treasury Department, kind of give short shrift to this set of issues, but I think it's important that we take them head on. I believe the PRC is pursuing a fourfold economic approach. The first element is to acquire foreign technology, and that's been going on since the time of Deng Xiaoping, by legal and illegal means, from laws that require foreign firms to turn over their secrets to gain access to the Chinese market, to espionage, good old-fashioned espionage and high-tech espionage. The second element is building state-backed Chinese firms into national champions with significant international market share and the access and the leverage that come with that. The third element is to construct alternative institutions to the financial arrangements that have been dominant and that have been couriers of Western influence. So you can think of the new Chinese Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that takes on the World Bank and other Western-backed lending institutions, to the new Chinese debt ratings agencies and alternatives to the SWIFT payment processing system, which will help insulate the PRC and its friends from Western sanctions, even if the dollar remains the international reserve currency. And a fourth element is the use of existing international trade and investment patterns to acquire political influence. So China has become the main trading partner of a lot of centrally geographically situated countries, so that China is then in a position to make political demands of them. That's the kind of economic side of the competition, and it's important in part because the Chinese see that trends in warfare, the advent of nuclear weapons at the end of the Second World War, have made all-out war, total war, basically unthinkable. It's too lethal. So at least according to these Chinese strategists, warfare and competition will probably mainly be waged in this kind of gray zone between war and peace. Because again, if total war is unthinkable, you have to use highly targeted, precise means, special operations forces, economic, diplomatic tactics. So I think that's where this competition is likely to be centered, unless and until the Chinese do something that nobody expects, but that triggers kind of a major American traditional military response. What are our options in this world, and how are we situated to compete in a kind of long-term gray zone competition with the Chinese? Defensively, I think we clearly need to figure out how to better protect our technologies and our economic interests, but that's easier said than done because our system is so open, and the technologies that exist, the internet in particular, make us so vulnerable. We, unlike the Chinese, don't have, and we're not building a closed internet, and our economic actors don't see the need to invest huge sums in building their firms into fortresses, cyber fortresses. So I think it's not going to be obvious how we can protect better our technologies, our trade secrets, our intellectual property. That's on the defensive side. On the offensive or proactive side, I think it's important to recognize we probably can't stop every undesirable Chinese behavior, but it would make sense to try to encourage whatever Chinese tendencies or behaviors exist today that are competitively counterproductive for them. That would be pushing on an open door, and it can't be that everything they're doing is strategically optimized and rational and perfect. So in the context of a long-term competition, there are probably things we can do now to encourage, or that we could do to encourage dysfunctional Chinese tendencies, both in terms of their foreign policy and in terms of their domestic policy. What do I mean? Well, with regard to their foreign policy, even without trying, just by our very existence as a global maritime power, we seem to be encouraging the PRC's fear of our ability to cut off its resources, and therefore its expensive regional and global power projection ambitions, and the development of capabilities like the aircraft carrier, the investments in continental infrastructure through Central Asia, through the One Belt, One Road initiative. It's probably not enough, however, to say that we should encourage the Chinese to keep trying to become a blue water navy or regional global power, because China's regional ambitions conflict directly with the interests of our allies and therefore with us, particularly in the maritime sphere. So I'm thinking of Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and the other South China Sea countries. Building up our friends and our allies would seem to strike at the Chinese sensitivity to being surrounded by hostile coalitions, those arcs and those anchors, and that history of hostile Western powers that seems to be a kind of deep-rooted fear. But after a certain point, it will be unnatural for the United States. At what point do countries like Japan become wholly autonomous? Our usual approach is to extend deterrence by promising to use US capabilities to protect our friends and actually discouraging them from going too far in developing their own defenses. But will that be enough in this case? Or if Japan, for instance, proceeds to become a more normal country with all of the defensive and offensive capabilities that that implies, will it still be our ally when it's no longer as dependent on us? So I think that's a kind of uncomfortable question that we probably have to confront. A final line of consideration beyond the defensive and the diplomatic and the military would be the PRC's internal divisions. How far should we seek to exploit them in a long-term competition? Allegedly, the PRC already spends more on internal security than on its external military forces, so this seems to be an area where resources are already being diverted from capabilities that are more threatening to the United States and its allies than the PRC's domestic control mechanisms are. But there's a human cost at stake, and if we really get into a competition involving mutual meddling, how should we evaluate their tradition and culture of control versus our openness? I'm not sure that the advantages on our side of the ledger when you start to think about cyber capabilities, for instance, as I mentioned. But this is all worth more thought, and I simply wanted to introduce the idea of an intensified competition, unfortunately, with the Chinese and the various economic, military, diplomatic, and other special methods that we might adopt to compete more effectively. So I look forward to your questions, and thank you again for coming.
Jackie, thank you very much. I think your talk was a perfect illustration of FPRI's geopolitical approach, covered history, geography, culture, and brought everything together in a very, very exceptional way. Okay, so we are open for questions now. FPRI rules for questions remain in place. They're modified Jeopardy rules. So please make any speeches or comments in the form of a question. And wait for the microphone.
Excuse me, I guess he was talking to me. I've been in China about 3 years ago, and it was a very interesting trip. Went to places not everybody goes to, and then took a trip down the Yangtze. And I observed a number of things then when China was booming. There's a lot of empty housing outside of the cities like Shanghai and Beijing. And I was rather surprised coming around a bend in the Yangtze River on the cruise downriver. There was a dark city emerging at dawn. Where were the lights? And I asked a few questions, and it seems that nobody was living in that city. And it was built for about 500,000 people. Now, I haven't been there in 3 years. I doubt if much has changed, basically, from what we're observing in the economy. But it would seem to me China is very vulnerable, especially now when you see some of the manufacturing jobs that were done in China going now to less expensive places. And you see people, like I've seen recently in the press, going back home to the rice paddy instead of mom moving there to one of those nice apartments that they thought they could afford for them. They're moving back where mom is. So I don't know. What's your impression, really, of how sound China's economy is in the near future?
Well, first of all, thank you. It sounds like your astute observations lead me to think that you know as much as I do about this. I think that China's on shaky economic ground, and they're in for some major challenges. The growth has already slowed. They're just, I guess, the Western economic prescription is they have to shift from export-led growth or investment-led growth to domestic consumption growth, which will be a lower rate but more stable and more productive over time. But they don't seem to be managing to achieve that. I think for a lot of structural reasons. And
what I was in effect saying is, I don't think they're much of a threat for the foreseeable future. They're going through what we went through, started to go through in 2008. Okay, my impression is that it's not just as simple as saying, oh, we only got 7% growth this year, we used 12 or something. They may not have any growth for a while.
I guess the question is, will they behave better or worse internationally in that context? And I'm not confident that they're going to behave better. I'm concerned that they're going to behave worse. Countries generally, I guess, behave badly when they're under a lot of domestic economic pressure, or at least it doesn't bring out the best in people, it's my impression. And, the resources that they're fighting over, or the control over important resource routes, which can translate into revenue, will become all the more attractive in a period where the other sources of growth don't seem to be as available. And the Chinese are already kind of primed to link internal problems with external threats. And so the fact that the rest of the world economically can't buy 8 to 10% more Chinese stuff, that will all be seen as part of a kind of conspiracy or a set of threats that they have to overcome. In China? Well, I mean, I guess what gives me pause is, the Soviet economy was stagnant and certainly not growing or doing particularly well for a long time, for decades, and yet they still seem to cause us and the world a lot of problems and to pose a serious threat. And the same thing, frankly, of the Russians today. I mean, it's not as though most people think that Russia is a very viable going concern or that it would be a good economic investment, but Putin seems to still be making use of what resources he has to cause trouble. In countries with big nuclear weapons arsenals, you have to take seriously, and they can pose problems even when they're not growing as fast as we are. Professor Waldron?
Could you comment on the
Sorry.
the shift in the demographics in China? I read something recently about how the one child per family policy has decimated the ranks, and that they're going to face serious labor shortages and problems as a result of that. Wouldn't that be another area that would make them very vulnerable?
Yes. I mean, the ratio of the dependency ratio, or the ratio of old people and young people who need support versus working age populations has already started to go in the wrong direction for China as a result of the one-child policy, but also because people just everywhere in the world almost stopped having as many babies, in the late 70s, early 80s, and China wasn't an exception, and the one-child policy certainly didn't help. But so what's interesting is now that they've relaxed the one-child policy, it's not at all clear that things are going to come back or come back in time. So to the extent that their growth model depends on moving working-age people into more productive factories from agricultural settings, that's not going to be an available source of growth in the future. So again, they have to figure out something different. They have to make their workers more productive or use more capital, and that transition just doesn't seem to be going as smoothly as a lot of economists would have hoped, or the Chinese leaders would have hoped. Yes, Professor Waldron.
Yeah, I'm Arthur Waldron from Penn. Again, this is an excellent talk. I detected a hint. What did Andy Marshall call them? Competitive strategies. Yes, I think that's very, very wise. My question is, you scarcely mentioned Russia at all until just now. And I've been asking myself, will Russia tolerate a situation in which China has so much power in, say, the Pacific area that she'd be in a position to threaten, say, Vladivostok or Kamchatka, which is more remote, but to threaten Russian interests there? And I would add to this just a little thought, which is that, of course, North Korea and Russia have got a common border. So if one were to exercise, if the Chinese were to exercise pressure on Korea, the Koreans could open up to the Russians. They've already got some relation with the Russians. I would add the Russians are trying to talk to the Japanese, but we're not letting them do that. But conceivably, the Russians could even gain access to North Korean ports on the west side of the peninsula, which would mean dominance of the Sloaks into Peking. Do you think that what do you think the Russian reaction will be if China just grows stronger and stronger around her Primorskaya Trust, whatever you call it?
Yeah. I think it's a very good question. I think there are, I personally am on the record saying that the recent kind of rapprochement or spate of good relations between Xi Jinping and Putin is doomed or cannot go on because of the structural sources of rivalry that you're pointing out. And the Chinese school children still learn that the Russians stole 1.5 million square kilometers of their territory in unequal treaties, and there's still concern, as far as I know, in Russia and Siberia, the Russian Far East, about Chinese people coming over the border and taking up residence, and there's a lot of nativism in Russia too, xenophobia, and China is also, as you mentioned or know, making inroads in the other part of Russia's traditional sphere in Central Asia. So how comfortable can that be for Moscow? Also increasingly, they're going to be competing on defense exports. The Chinese have reverse engineered a lot of the technologies that the Russians transferred, and now they're building their own defense capabilities and exporting them to potential Russian clients. And also the Chinese are already very sensitive to Russia's defense relationship with India and with Mongolia and with Vietnam. The transfer of Russian submarines to Vietnam was a major source of concern, I think, in Beijing, at least before the Russian Crimean adventure and then Russia's turn to China for financial support in the wake of the Western reaction to that. So at least in the short term, it does look as though the PRC is one of Russia's only options right now, but they're driving hard bargains on gas, and it doesn't seem over the long term, or it does seem in the long term, that the old sources of rivalry will reassert themselves. The Chinese obviously have their own ambitions for port access in North Korea, and probably, or for all we know, in the Russian Far East eventually. So it'll be an interesting, and also their interests are competitive in the Arctic, as you know. The Russians basically want to control those waterways, and the Chinese are saying it's international, and we're 1/5 of humanity, so we should have access to 1/5 of it. And so I think there's going to be more tense competition up there. One of the only public statements you can find of a Russian military officer saying that China is a threat is the Russian Far North commander saying, I'm worried about them in the Arctic. So.
Me? I was a little bit surprised by the volume of zero-sum competitive communication coming out of China, because that wasn't, at least commercially, an experience that I had. But taking that as a given, how do you see in the competitors, how do you size up the single one-party system that the Chinese have in terms of nimbleness, being able to direct long-term and short-term strategy versus our own two-party system and our own semi-efficient political system that we have here? How do you see that affecting the competition?
It's a very good question. I guess some people might be inclined to throw up their hands now about the U.S. system, given what's going on in the presidential race, which is probably the subject of a whole other talk. Maybe that's the U.S. Civil War talk that's next. But in general, I think we have to be careful about despairing, or I think, the United States was able to prosecute a consistent strategy in the Cold War over many different administrations, and I think we sometimes surprise ourselves, in some of the apparent sources of our dysfunction are sources of strength, like the limited government helps us be economically dynamic and technologically innovative, and the Chinese are going to be, so they do have the strength that comes with a one-party system, or at least the central rule, but they have a lot of liabilities that go along with it, like the dysfunctional economic system and internal stability concerns, legitimacy concerns that make them paranoid. So.
I guess, are we taking that into account in terms of how we size up the competition? Because you're right, in terms of innovation and stuff, it's still the United States that breeds innovation, and the Chinese that position themselves in universities in ways to try and grow a strength, but it's done in the Chinese way. But on the other hand, if you look at when you were talking about corruption, and it's pretty remarkable, actually, the way the Chinese have turned on corruption and tried to get control of better environmental issues, that they're able to say, okay, this is bad, we need a priority, and they've got a priority. It's a different kind of competitive than we have in other places in the world.
Yeah. I'm concerned that we are, well, as I said, we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about how we approach them economically, or the economic aspects of the competition, because it does seem to be a gap in our system that, the Defense Department does what it does and worries about China's so-called anti-access, area denial capabilities, but there's only emerging now concern about the health of the U.S. defense industrial base. which gets at the economic warfare and espionage side of things. But I think we probably have the ability to create the tools that we need if we actually get serious, or when we get serious, as we appear to be now, about the threat. I just have been reading about the history of the early Cold War, and there was a period after World War II where we'd had the OSS, but we didn't have the CIA, and all of these new offices were launched that helped us engage in competition in Europe and did things that we didn't know probably that we could do before those offices got started and got budgets, and then all of a sudden we were sort of off to the races. So part of me thinks that it's just a question of attention and mind share. On the anti-corruption campaign, I wouldn't be too impressed, because I think, as long as it's a one-party system, there's still going to be corruption. And if you look, there are interesting patterns in who's being targeted, and it's not clearly just all the people who have profited illegally, it's people who are enemies of Xi. And also on the environment, China continues to rely on coal and will for the foreseeable future. And so, unfortunately, the air that they breathe and that Japan breathes and that the neighborhood breathes is, I think, going to stay fairly deleterious or horrible. So, yeah, poisonous.
Yes, thank you so much for such an informative talk and covering so many aspects of the relationship. I had a question about your point. You said there was a four-point economic strategy on the part of the Chinese. And the second one that you brought up was you mentioned that China's planning or striving to turn state-owned enterprises into state champions. And I was hoping you'd say a little more about that. My understanding is that, these state-owned enterprises are such a drain economically. It almost seems like they'd be throwing, good money after bad in that strategy. So, thanks.
Yeah, I agree. At the same time, you see there are, even if it's expensive or not, from a purely economic point of view, a good strategy, there are political benefits that the Chinese government gets from backing these national champions and having them go build infrastructure in Africa, build sensitive telecommunications lines, infrastructure. You get political influence over governments when you control their communications lines and their national arteries, and when you build the barracks for the military or the resorts and palaces for the rulers in corrupt countries. So there is, even though it's not economically logical or purely economically logical, because of the political influence that they get from it and the access to technology, I think that there's a case to be made, at least, that it's consistent with other aspects of their strategy. But again, we're also back to the fact that there are clearly Chinese economic vulnerabilities and constraints that they're going to be facing increasingly. And it'll be interesting to see how the strategies that they've been employing that seem to be kind of expensive, dependent on cash outlays, how that works in a time when they're more constrained, when they're drawing down their reserves, when money is flowing out of the country, and how does that lead the leadership to behave? Again, I'm concerned that it's going to make the behavior worse from a assertiveness or aggression point of view, not better, but yes.
My questions deal with Taiwan. There's a new administration going to take power in May, and the pro-China Kuomintang has lost power. Now, Xi Jinping has declared that if the new administration doesn't accept the idea that Taiwan is part of China, then he said, the mountain would shake and the earth would move. No, he said that, 山摇地动, In your estimation, what's the likelihood that Xi Jinping would actually resort to coercive measures before President Obama's term ends, try to coerce Taiwan into surrendering its separate existence, fearing that Obama is so averse to foreign military entanglement, he might just acquiesce in Taiwan's fall?
I agree that that's a risk. I think in general, and I think it's partly wishful thinking, or it's a lot of wishful thinking, at least until this election, the analysis in the PRC had been that things were basically trending in the right direction with Taiwan because, as they would put it, the material and the spiritual foundations for reunification, as they would put it, were increasing in the sense of trade ties were growing, investment ties. So Taiwanese voters would have the sense that it was in their economic interest to be better, closer aligned with the mainland. And then the spiritual ties point, this is where I think there's a lot of wishful thinking. My observation is the more mainland people, the more Chinese people go to Taiwan, the less like they are, or the more the Taiwanese sense of separate identity is felt. But I think the Chinese were telling themselves, the mainland was telling themselves that things were going in their favor in that direction. But I think that right now we're seeing the leadership, Xi Jinping, try to figure things out and test the waters and make probes and see how far Tsai Ing-wen is going to go, and whether this is something that can be managed or whether force is necessary or some kind of shock or a lesson teaching, I guess would be the kind of Chinese framework for it, is necessary. So I agree that there's a risk, and we'll see. I thought it was unfortunate that the United States reacted the way it did to the outgoing KMT leader's visit to, was it Itu Aba, the main South China Sea island. We blamed him for stoking up tensions, but that seems egregious in the face of all the other Chinese activities that's actively inflaming the region and building up China's claim. It seems like he was injecting some sort of balance, but we'll see what happens. I hope that the Chinese reading of the administration isn't so permissive that they do something that they'll regret.
Mine's Michael. I started at Penn in the late 70s. I just wonder, how does China perceive the next election? Do you think they will try and influence it in any way?
In the United States?
Our election.
Well, I mean, there is a history of campaign finance scandals involving, I think, Chinese fundraisers. So there will be efforts, but I think it's almost a guarantee that whoever comes into office next, as I kind of was arguing in the talk, will take a tougher line on the PRC based on China's behavior, based on just the trends that are observable that are leading the conflictual aspects or the competitive parts of the relationship to come to the fore. So whether it's Hillary Clinton and whose campaign's emails were hacked, whose State Department, who was yelled at by Yang Jiechi, the former Chinese minister, whose State Department people had to deal with China's kind of rising assertiveness over the last 7 years, or in the Obama first term, or whether it's the more hawkish-seeming Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz, who just sponsored a bill in the Senate that passed to name the street outside the U.S. Embassy in China, Liu Xiaobo Boulevard. I mean, it just seems whoever it is going to take a tougher line.
Could you comment on the what China thinks about North Korea? In a sense, we inherited South Korea, they inherited North Korea as the leftovers of the Korean fight. Do they think of them as their little pit bull that they can let out and scare people every now and then? What's your opinion?
It's a very good question. I don't think that they have as much control as they would like to have, or I'm not sure the image of the pit bull is exactly right. On the other hand, it has clearly been useful to Beijing to have been seen as kind of an international honest broker dealing with the North Koreans on our behalf or on behalf of the other parties in the six-party talks. And it's been useful for them to be seen as the more reasonable, just like with Russia, with both the DPRK and Russia today. China can say, well, whatever we're doing in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, it's not as crazy as what Putin has done or the missile tests and nuclear tests that Kim keeps firing off. So by comparison, China benefits from that as well. Also, I think from the mainland point of view, the current situation there is preferable to the foreseeable alternative, which would be a unified peninsula under some kind of South Korean democratic rule, especially given the U.S. relationship with South Korea. But so I think while the North Koreans aren't quite as pliant or docile or quiescent as the Chinese would like, they're unpredictable, they're still China's clients. And if Beijing wanted to, it could turn off the spigots of support that enable the DPRK to survive. So the fact that it doesn't leads me to believe, again, think that they prefer the status quo to the alternatives and that they see some uses in it. Also, I mean, even more potentially nefariously, you could say that to the extent that Chinese strategists believe that the period of strategic opportunity exists because we're diverted to the Middle East, it's interesting to think about the record of North Korean proliferation to Middle Eastern actors and Chinese complicity in that because of overflights. More nefariously, there's that connection as well.
We have time for one last question from Jacqueline, Director of Brady.
Okay.
Hi, Jackie. Terrific as always.
Nice to see you.
Wanted to ask you two questions. One is how much would, if it gets through, or will if it does get through, the TPP help address some of the issues you're talking about in terms of U.S. commitments to the allies and their sense of a U.S. presence in the region? And secondly, in your sort of downturn in the Chinese behavior toward the outside world, one piece that wasn't in your talk I'd like to hear your comments on is what happened to Chinese soft power? And it wasn't that many years ago that we were hearing about the charm offensive and how in public diplomacy China was eating the U.S.'s lunch. That's clearly reversed. Was that just something that fell apart, or do you think it was a strategic choice on their part, perhaps an unwise one, just to move from that to a more assertive posture?
Okay. The TPP, I think, would certainly be helpful because it would encourage countries in Southeast Asia, which right now have China as their main economic partner. It would help diversify their options so that they're not as dependent economically on China, so that they won't be dependent politically on China. But it's clearly not the full answer. It's just a step that seems like it would be constructive and productive. But I mean, it doesn't answer the question of Chinese technology transfer or acquisition, illegal, legal, or the other aspects of the economic competition. I mean, I'm in favor of it, but it's not the end of the story. It would be a good move. On the issue of China's soft power and what happened to it, or charm offensive, I think it was the sort of structural factors, the growth in China's power, the rise in their dependence on overseas assets, and their sense of insecurity about their position that led them to be tougher, more assertive, and their sense of confidence because of their wealth and the 2008 downturn, and also the structural issue of the need to test their new capabilities as they acquired them. At some point, it was just impossible to hide, the anti-satellite weapons or the aircraft carrier when it was going to get deployed. The systems like that were just too much for that approach. And then probably also there's some kind of emotional or hormonal or thumatic element of the Chinese leaderships just being more caustic and belligerent in international forums. I mean, I think it's hard if you experience 2 or 3 decades of incredible success and sustained economic growth, and people are patting you on the back and calling you brilliant and saying you're responsible for the biggest lifting of people out of poverty historically ever. It's hard not to get too big for your britches, probably, too.
Well, thank you very much, Jackie. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. I want to thank Stan and Arlene Ginsburg for sponsoring this lecture series. I want to thank Gwen Borowski and the National Liberty Museum and staff for being a first-rate host of ours here. And I just want to let you know, if anybody is new to FPRI and you liked what you heard, please see either Peyton Wendell or Eli Gilman in the back. So have a good night, and thank you for coming out.